do a little spiel about fevers. But a lot of the reason why I wanted to do this, like I mentioned, is because I do see a lot of fever phobia. And what I mean is parents coming in worried about their child and the fever. And I'm so glad to be here, Bracha. So worried about worried about fever and not knowing when to be concerned and when they can monitor. So first, I wanted to talk about fever in general. So fever is 100.4. So 100.4 Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Of course, 99, 100 can feel like warmer than your child normally is, but we have to give a number and a set point to define fever, and it is 100.4. So if your child has a 99, 100.1, it's not considered a fever. Obviously, anything over 100.4 is considered a fever. 38 Celsius if you prefer to do that. But fever is a common cause for concern, and thankfully in children, it's actually not as worrisome as if, an adult gets a fever or something like that. So I commonly find adult doctors, family doctors, they're way more concerned about fever than we are as pediatricians because we know that the child's immune response is much weaker. So even a virus, which for us is not a big deal, even a virus is going to cause them to mount a fever. So the first thing I wanted to go over is what thermometer should you use? Everyone is commonly asking me this. Really, there's no thermometer that your pediatrician should be advertising and sponsoring because they're all actually pretty much the same. Now, the biggest thing though is rectal thermometers. Rectal thermometers are going to be the most accurate. And under the age of 2 months for sure, we're gonna ask you to take a temperature via a rectal thermometer if your child has a fever. How do you know if your child has a fever, especially under 2 months? They're going to feel warm to you, especially the back of their neck versus their hands or their body. It's going to be the back of the neck is sweaty. They're sweating through their clothes. They're irritable, inconsolable. On the flip side, they're just more sleepy. They're feeling warm to you. That's when you're going to check a temperature. Any fever over 100.4 in a baby under 2 months of age needs to be evaluated. So when I said fever is not a concern all the time, in babies it is because their immune system is much more immature, and under the age of 2 months we'd want to evaluate that. So under 2 months, rectal thermometer. Now, rectal thermometers are actually recommended up till about 3 years of age, which you're like, wow, how am I going to get my child to do a rectal temp at 2.5 years? But it is the most accurate. It gives you the best core temperature. What I mean by core temperature, it's the temp of the body that's most accurate. Forehead, ear, the temporal artery, which is an artery that runs down here. All those thermometers could be accurate, but they're not as accurate as rectal. So if you want the real number, you're going to go straight to the rectal. And you're going to put a little Vaseline at the tip, and it's actually really easy with the digital thermometers because it'll start blipping when it's starting to read, so you know you're not going in too far. The other thing about thermometers, there are underarm thermometers, oral, so oral, axillary, which is obviously underarm. There's the temporal scanners. All of these are commonly used as well. I would say the best one of the other ones besides rectal are your underarm and your mouth, but the mouth one has to have a cooperative young kid. So your baby may not obviously close their mouth down, even a toddler might not. So that may be your older child. The temporal one, the one that you scan, that's actually the least accurate of all of them. So maybe you've seen ads for them. They're the least accurate. At the end of the day, unless your child's under 2 months of age, which is why we want that rectal thermometer, if your child's under 2 months of age and has a fever over 100.4, you're going to want to let your pediatrician or your child's doctor know. Now, if they're older than 2 months and they feel warm for you and you don't have a rectal thermometer, your doctor is going to ask you to look at how they are doing clinically. What this means is if your child is feeling warm to you and has a fever, but they are consolable, they're staying hydrated, and they're not having breathing difficulty, these are great things that you can monitor. Now, of course, when your child's having a fever, they may be irritable. They may be upset at you, right? They're not going to be always happy and playful. So if your child is uncomfortable with that fever, and again, we're talking about children over 2 months of age, because under 2 months, you have to let your pediatrician know. So if just say we're talking about a 6-month-old, okay? A 6-month-old, you feel them and they're warm, but they're still playing with you, smiling at you, great. But it's the irritability, the inconsolability that we are medicating. And this is the biggest tip I have with fever phobia, or fever in general. We commonly want to medicate the number, but you need to start medicating how the child's acting. So for example, in my office, I want to use a little anecdote. In my office, I'll see a kid come in, like a 2-year-old, 104 fever, running around, happy. The mom or dad is like, hey, why aren't we giving the child Tylenol or Motrin? You don't have to medicate a child who's acting great with a fever. The fever is the body's response to an illness, right? If it's not bothering them and not making them irritable, you don't necessarily have to treat it. You can use comfort measures like putting a cool rag on their head, giving them a nice warm bath. You don't want to make sure it's too cold or too hot, just the kind of lukewarm. But those are things that you can do for a fever. You don't necessarily have to medicate. So commonly parents are, reaching for the medicine. They're panicking because in the middle of the night, their child fell asleep with the fever. If a child falls asleep with the fever, you want to look at, well, were they hydrated during the day so far? Were they making wet diapers? Sleeping means that they're consolable, so that's okay. Commonly parents will go and feel the kid and try to wake them up to give them medicine. If the child's sleeping comfortably and right before they fell asleep, they were drinking something, they were consolable, let them sleep. If they wake up, you use that as an opportunity to check a temperature. Of course, if they woke up from that nap or that nighttime sleep, they're probably irritable. You can use that as an opportunity to give them Tylenol or Motrin to make them feel more comfortable. So that is a really important concept, that we treat symptoms. We don't treat the number. So a common myth that I hear is fever is going to cause seizures, and that was actually common. That was actually a comment in the advertisement for this live. That's actually false. So there are some situations where children have something called fever seizures, but this is a small subset of the population. This is actually something that's hereditary also, so maybe grandma or grandpa or mom or dad or whichever relative has it, and then the child gets it. So unfortunately, there's no way of knowing fully which child is predisposed to fever seizures. But with fever seizures, and I have a whole podcast episode coming about fever seizures, with this fever seizure, it is not recommended that you have to treat every fever. You're treating, obviously, the fever if your child's irritable, but fever seizures are its own different entity. Not every kid is going to have fever seizures, so you do not have to medicate your child in fear of fever seizures. As I talk about in this future upcoming episode, it's more so that it's not the high fever that's causing these children to seize. It's actually an enzyme that's released in fever in some children causes them to seize. So you don't have to fear the fever, because it doesn't mean that every fever that rises, your child's going to have a seizure. If you have a family history of fever seizures and you know this, you should talk to your pediatrician and they can give you their guidance. But the general population, no known fever seizure, it is not recommended that you have to medicate to keep the fever down. Because like we said, the fever is the body's natural response to fighting an infection. So that is one common myth that I hear. So the other common myth is that a high fever causes brain damage. Of course, a temperature over 107, which is really high, is not something we want to see. But if that is getting that high, what should you do, right? If the child's any fever, what should you do? If your child's unwell, you have to medicate, right? If you're unsure of what to do or the dosing, you can call your pediatrician's emergency line, your doctor's emergency line, and see what they say. But it's not the actual number that concerns us, is how your child's acting. I'll be honest, if your child's 107, running a 107 temperature, they're probably not going to be so comfortable. Your doctor's going to want you to medicate that child and see what happens after the medicine. Do they become more consolable? Do they start to drink more liquids? If that's happening, that's really reassuring. But of course, if they are 105, 104, you give them medicine and they're still irritable, still inconsolable, like an hour later that fever is not budging and they're just inconsolable, that's a kid we're gonna want to check out. So the one mistake I see parents make is that the minute they see a child have a fever, they panic, right? Because it's scary, their child's upset, they're burning up, and that is obviously very, very true, and I understand that. But the first thing I want you to do is find that thermometer. If you can't find the thermometer because you don't know where it is, you don't have one, If your child is feeling warm to you and acting unwell and you can't find that thermometer, it's okay to medicate. It's nice to get a gauge of what the number is, but we know that if your child's unwell, like I said earlier, you are medicating how your child's acting and not the number. The number will give us some insight into tracking and see how high it is, but it is okay to medicate if you can't find that thermometer. Now, an hour later, if your child is still fussy, still feeling warm, that's a situation that you'll probably want to speak to your child's doctor, because then in that situation, we want to know, well, this fever is still there, making the child uncomfortable, and should we evaluate them now? Now, just say you have a situation, like I said, where the child had a fever, you gave them Motrin or Tylenol, and they fell back asleep. Now you can monitor this fever. And what does monitoring fevers mean? And again, as another disclaimer, any kid over 2 months of age, this applies to. Under 2 months, any fever needs to be reported to your pediatrician. Obviously, if it's your child's first fever ever, it's okay to talk to your pediatrician, because if you have certain medical history for your child, or if you have any questions, they'll guide your care appropriately. So if your child's older and is 104, 103, and you give them medicine, and then now they're a little more comfortable and they fall asleep, you can let them sleep. And if they wake up, you kind of repeat the cycle. If they're feverish, if they're inconsolable, then you medicate with Motrin or Tylenol. Again, medicate how they're acting and not the number is the key with fevers. The other thing you're monitoring is, are they hydrated? So obviously whatever age they are, formula, breast milk if they're infants, milk, water, any hydration that they normally do if they're older, that is what you're going to want to monitor. So fever, are they hydrated? Fever, do they have difficulty breathing? So this is actually really important. So difficulty breathing would look like here. I'm going to actually tilt this. Here. If they're retracting, that's the word that we use. Retractions are basically right here, and right here in the ribs. You're seeing go. And if that's happening with the fever and you give them medicine and they're still retracting, and medicine being Motrin or Tylenol, you should talk to your pediatrician. The other thing is if they're just inconsolable, like I mentioned, if they have a 103, you give them medicine, Motrin or Tylenol, and they're still inconsolable, you need to talk to your doctor, because we want to make sure, well, why are they inconsolable? What does this fever mean? But if you are able to medicate them for comfort and they are playful or at least resting, drinking, breathing comfortably, and consolable, these are reassuring signs. The other thing, and of course if your child has any other medical history, please run this by your pediatrician, is fever persistence. So if your child has 2 days of fever, they're hydrated, they're breathing comfortably, awesome. But if they start to get to 3 days of fever, 4 days of fever, especially 5 days of fever. If a child has 5 days of fever, even if they are hydrated, inconsolable, and even if they are hydrated, consolable, and not having breathing difficulty, you want them to be checked out by their pediatrician. So I use the 5-day rule for any kid with a fever, regardless of how they're acting. But in those 5 days, you're monitoring. And if anything changes, they're not breathing comfortably, they're not staying hydrated, or they're inconsolable, you go in earlier. That is kind of how you gauge it. So of course, do not let your child go 4 or 5 days if your child's super inconsolable with the fever at 2 days and Motrin and Tylenol is not helping, because we want to assess that child. One final comment before I open this up to questions. Hello everyone, it's so nice to hear from you. So I'll go through some questions, but the other thing is about Motrin and Tylenol. So Tylenol is also called acetaminophen. So acetaminophen is your generic version of Tylenol. So I use the brand names, but you obviously can get generic. Motrin is ibuprofen. So ibuprofen is also Advil, and then obviously Motrin as well. So you can do children's of both. So for both of these, you cannot use ibuprofen or Motrin under the age of 6 months. So 6 months plus, your options are Motrin, ibuprofen, or Tylenol, acetaminophen. Over 2 months of age, then you can obviously use Tylenol up until, obviously 6 months, when you can add on Motrin or Tylenol as well. But you should not be using Motrin under 6 months of age. The reason is the kidneys are not fully formed. So too much Motrin can be overwhelming to their kidney system, and that's how Motrin leaves the body. So that is kind of fever phobia in a nutshell. But I'm going to go over some questions now for the remainder of the time. Let's see. Let's see. So I'm going to just go in order here as long as I have time. And I am so grateful for all of you all being here. So what about the ear ones? So the ones that go in the ears. So that's actually a great question. So ear thermometers are actually on the same level, in my opinion, as your a little, basically in order of preference if you want to rank them. Rectal is the best. Rectal is your highest accuracy, okay? Then it would be underarm and oral, but of course age appropriately they may not. And then it would be ear, and then it would be temporal. The technology is changing though, so we may see that temporal thermometers may get to be more accurate, but remember my rule that I said earlier, it really is how your child's acting. So if it's, some parents will be so frustrated, they're like, doctor, 2 different thermometers are saying 2 different things, I don't know what to read. And I say, look at your kid, how are they acting? Are they comfortable? Are they consolable? If they are, great. If they're not, you medicate. So yes, the having a good thermometer is nice, but even just going straight to the rectal if you're super concerned. But at the end of the day, you are medicating how your child's acting, which is way more important. Yes, I know, Elizabeth, it's scary. Fevers are super scary. So I totally understand that. And that's why I wanted to do this. And at the end, I'll go over, my page and my podcast that has way more information about all of this, because my goal is to remove the fear surrounding parenting, including when your child's sick. So what can we do if the child starts with seizures with the tongue? So I am going to answer this. I know it sounds a little scary, but I think it's important that you guys are educated about this, okay? So seizure activity is very obvious, and it's movement of the upper extremities in rhythmic motion, lower extremities in the rhythmic motion. My son actually had a seizure when he was born, so personally I know this fear, okay? I hope hearing that from you makes you all understand that I know it's scary from first-hand experience. My son had that, and it is hard to see. But what you want to do is, if your child does have that and it's the first time they ever have it, you want to obviously get them to a safe space, which is on the ground, so that they can't fall from anywhere. Just say they're in the high chair, wherever they are, okay? You want to put them on the ground, you want to lay them on their side, and you want to get a phone to call 911, because this is the first time it's ever happening. Even if it stops, I would love for you guys to have a medical professional with you. That being said, it does not mean that your child's going to have seizures. It does not mean that your child is going to have this febrile seizures is what we call it. It's a small subset of people, about 10%, 7 to 10% of the population can have it. And unfortunately, there's no test to make sure if your child has fever seizure. Kind of going back, well, doctor, why don't we just treat every fever then? Right? If I'm scared of fever seizures, I should just treat every seizure. The reality is, even with fever seizures, our fever seizure patients can still have seizures with fever seizures, because it doesn't have to do with the exact number. It has to do with this enzyme that's released when you have a fever that is just in certain babies and certain kids in fever seizures. So, and also you risk overdosing if you keep trying to treat every number, right? If your child's happy and playful and consolable, you could overdo the medicine, because Tylenol can be only given every 6 hours. Motrin can be given every 4. So if your child is like mounting fevers from, just say, a virus, consolable, but just mounting fevers, you could overdo the medicine. And that's why we don't like overdoing it. I'm so glad, Crystal, that this is so helpful. Yes. Does dollar store medication work as well? So that means, like, I'm guessing acetaminophen and Motrin, as long as the expiration date is okay. So just make sure it's accurate. As long as it's accurate and not expired, I'm okay with that. Are rashes common with fevers? This is a great question. Actually, they can be. So remember what I said earlier, the most common reason children do get fevers is viruses. Now, of course, I mentioned the red flags, right? Not breathing comfortably, not hydrated, super irritable. We'd want to make sure, is this still viral, or is it an ear infection? Is it obviously a chest infection? Do we need to do something more workup, like urine studies, blood studies, to make sure it's not bacterial? But viruses do cause fever, and with viruses can come rashes. I can do a whole different segment about rashes if you guys want to, like when to be worried about them. I think they had asked me maybe to do that one, but I would love to speak to you all about that. And again, my Instagram and my podcast has more information, which I'll talk about at the end. If you have a squirmy child and just an oral thermometer, can you use it under the arm and get an accurate reading? I've heard you need to add a degree. Is that true? So as long as so you have to read the thermometer. So it should say for oral, axillary, underarm, or rectal use. So as long as your thermometer has those 3 options, which most thermometers that are okay for oral also have multi-use for axillary and rectal, then you can obviously use it under the underarm, okay? So that is okay to use under the arm. And the whole add a degree minus subtract a degree, yes, you're right that people do say add a degree for under the arm, but the reason I'm not is because of what I mentioned earlier, that just say your child has a 100.4 versus a 101, you are going to be medicating them because of their irritability, and I'm going to mark that as a fever. So whether it's 102 versus 101 doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because you're going to be medicating your child if they're uncomfortable, if that makes sense. Should you always, actually the next one is 104 too high for teething? Yes, this is a great myth that I always hear. So teething can cause 99, 100, 100.2. Teething would not cause 100.4 and above. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, I swear my kid teethes and gets a fever. Sure, the temperature can kind of fluctuate even when you're not checking the temperature every hour or every day. So imagine this. If you actually were to check your child's temperature every single day, it could fluctuate, 99, 100. You're just not checking it because your child's not miserable. So now your child's teething and it's cued you in. You're like, oh my gosh, I should check a temperature. And it comes up as 100.1, 100.3. And you're like, oh my gosh, there's, it has to be teething. So teething can cause 99, 100, but it's not going to cause a true fever over 100.4. Definitely not a fever over 101. The reason I want to bring that up is that if it's 101 or even if it's 100.4, you want to use the rules that I mentioned, because if your child's irritable, inconsolable with a 101 for 5 days, obviously for 2 days and not staying hydrated, you're going to want to bring that up to your pediatrician, because we're concerned it's not teething actually, that it's something else we need to evaluate. So that is one thing I'm really happy to clear up. Should you always have 2 different thermometers for accuracy? That is up to you. And again, having one that has oral, axillary, and rectal option is great. Having a temporal is great also. I'm fine with that, but that can be really stressful in the moment because you're trying to gauge the 2 different ones. I mentioned that earlier. So really have one that you like. And again, you're going by how your child's acting. Of course, if your child's younger or if you're not sure, it's rectal as the most accurate one. And rectal can be used under 3. I know most people don't want to use a rectal on a toddler, which I'm understandable, but if you're super concerned, the rectal is going to give you the most accurate one. If you really feel like your thermometer's wrong and your child's acting upset and burning up, you can have a second one on hand. But then again, if your child's burning up, the thermometer's reading like 99 and your child's upset, go ahead and medicate them and let your pediatrician know if need be based on my rules. Yes, I would love to do a rash one, Crystal. Yes, everyone wants rashes. I love it. I love it. Other ways to treat a fever other than medicine. I love this question. I briefly mentioned this. So cooling them down. The thing about cooling them down is that you don't want to get them into a very cold bath or a very hot bath. The hot bath is going to make them very uncomfortable. A cold bath is also going to make them very uncomfortable because their body temperature will basically, it'll mess up their thermostat. My big advice is like a cool rag on their forehead versus a bath. Baths are fine, but if you're going to use bath, it needs to be lukewarm. I just find that if you've ever been sick with like the flu or fever, when you take a shower, and again, if you take a hot shower, you're going to feel sick. If you take a cold shower, you're going to have chills. And if you take a lukewarm shower, it doesn't really help much. So having a rag, like a cool washcloth on your forehead will help. The problem with doing too much submersion in like a cold water or lukewarm water or even hot is that it can mess up with your internal thermostat and they can get rigors. So they can start to shake, right? Because their body is hot and now you're dumping them into something a little more cool and their body doesn't know what to do with that. Rigors are not dangerous, but it's going to make you feel a little more uncomfortable. So my advice is going more towards the rag on the forehead to cool them down. They also sell like over the counter these cooling packs, like these little gel packs that you put on their forehead. I'm okay with those things. Better than a bath. So the bath, I have heard and I have seen that sometimes the kids, they start doing that because they're so cold. They're so cold now because they were hot, and now you put them into water that was cooler than their body temperature. What if temperature seems low? So that's a great question. So if it's especially if it's an infant under the age of 2 months, anything under 96 degrees taken rectally, you should also let your pediatrician know. So we don't talk about, hypothermia that much, but hypothermia would be under 96. Of course, if your older child is seeming cold and right under 96, older child over 2 months, and you can't get them warm by bundling them, definitely let your pediatrician know. But 96 degrees is that lower end of a normal temperature. Oh yes, and popsicles are good for a fever. Also, I don't mind that. It's cooling, but it also can help with hydration. Pedialyte has a good brand of popsicles, lower sugar. I like any of those. Whatever you guys have on hand is perfectly fine. But the popsicles are fine. And then also, like I said, hydration. The last thing about hydration, unless I have any other questions, is hydration is the forms that you normally give your child. Breast milk or formula, water, milk, juice, whatever y'all are drinking for older kids. If they're not taking that, then you give them Pedialyte. So that's when Pedialyte comes in. Also, if a child's vomiting, we do Pedialyte as well. Are there any other questions? Oh, this was so great. I'm so glad. I really love talking about fevers. I got some really great questions. And again, this will be saved for you all for future reference. But I did want to talk about my Instagram as well as my podcast because I share so much more about fevers and about all these other topics that you probably like, I just want to talk to a doctor about it. It's Peds Doc Talk. So I'm going to actually write that in the comment section. And then the podcast is the Peds Doc Talk podcast. So on my Instagram, I share a lot of different things about mothering, about being a pediatrician, and about all these educational topics. And I do Q&As every Monday. Sometimes I don't if I have, a personal engagement. I moved this Monday, so I didn't do it. But I do a lot of Q&As every Monday, time permitting. I do a lot of interactive content on my stories so that you can get these questions asked. I obviously can't give personal medical advice. So if you say, hey, doctor, my child has this going on, what can I do? I can't give you that advice, but I can do an educational topic about rashes, about fever, to give you guys some guidance. So follow me there, Peds Doc Talk, and then also on my podcast, the Peds Doc Talk podcast, especially for a lot of you first-time parents. I have a lot of things about eating, sleeping, behavior, especially with COVID going on. I did a lot of topics on COVID. So a lot of information, and you can find me there. And thank you, BabyFirst, for attaching that. I love it. But it was such a pleasure talking to you all today. I hope to do this again. We'll talk about rashes or whatever other topics that you all want to do. But definitely ask me any more questions and follow me at my Instagram and listen to my podcast. Thank you, BabyFirst. Bye. I'm signing off.